That Christmas dinner is burned into me like a scar. Not because of the roast turkey, the glow of the candles, or the smell of cinnamon, but because my son looked across the table, locked eyes with me, and decided to turn the night into his personal stage for humiliation. It was just after the first round of toasts. The chatter had been warm and easy. Stories from my sister about her kids' school plays. Laughter over a cousin's terrible attempt at mulled wine. The kind of holiday noise that fills a house until it feels almost too full. I was halfway through my glass when Michael, my only child, tapped his fork against his plate to get everyone's attention. "I think we should all take a moment to be grateful for what we have," he said, smiling in that way he does when he's winding up for a punchline. Some of us never had the courage to chase big dreams. But hey, at least we're still here, right? There was a half-second of silence, then the laughter rolled in. First a few chuckles, then the fuller kind that comes when people think they've been given permission to join in. My sister glanced at me, uncertain. His fiancée laughed the loudest. I didn't move. My fork hovered above my plate, the lamb cooling in the air. Inside, I felt the first cold ripple of something I'd been holding back for months. Outside, my expression didn't change. Michael leaned back in his chair, enjoying himself, basking in the small, mean triumph of the moment. He didn't notice that my eyes stayed on him, steady and unblinking. He didn't see the way my hand rested lightly on the stem of my glass, not because I was nervous, but because I was counting. He had no idea that I'd been carrying something. Something he didn't want the people at this table to know. And unlike his little jabs, mine wasn't a joke. Mine was a fact. A truth sharp enough to cut through that smirk and leave him bare in front of everyone he was trying to impress. I didn't plan to use it tonight, but the thing about humiliation is that it's rarely one-sided. Give someone enough rope, and they'll pull it tight themselves. Michael was tugging hard. The table moved on to another conversation, but my mind stayed locked on the moment. I could feel it building, the same way you feel a storm before you see the first flash of lightning. And I knew, before the dessert tray came out, before the first slice of pie hit a plate, this night would turn, and it wouldn't be in his favor. I sipped my wine slowly, letting the warmth spread. The room glowed with soft golden light, the Christmas tree in the corner twinkling like a postcard. It all felt like a fragile snow globe, perfect on the surface, but one shake away from collapse. He thought he was in control. He thought he'd landed a clean shot. What he didn't know was that Christmas was about to be the night he learned that I don't swing unless I plan to connect. 3 months earlier, I'd stumbled onto something about him. Something that explained more than he'd ever admit. Something that made tonight's mockery almost laughable. And it all started with a package he hadn't meant for me to see. 3 months before that Christmas, Michael had already started changing his tone with me. It wasn't one big blow-up, no shouting matches, no slammed doors. It was more like rust on metal. Slow, creeping, and easy to miss until you ran your hand over it and felt the roughness. At first, it came as small, almost playful comments. "You still using that old flip phone, Dad? Man, that truck's a relic. You should donate it to a museum." On their own, they were harmless. I even laughed the first few times. But the laughter stopped when I realized the jokes were less about the objects and more about me. Then it turned into subtle corrections. If I told a story, he'd jump in with, "That's not how it happened," and tweak the details in a way that made me look forgetful. If I offered advice, he'd roll his eyes just enough for the people around us to notice. It wasn't blatant disrespect. It was a slow erosion of it. I'd seen this kind of behavior before, not in my own family, but during my years as a manager at the plant. Some young guys would try to build themselves up by chipping away at whoever they saw as the old guard. Michael didn't work at the plant, but he'd picked up the same habit somewhere. Maybe it was the crowd he'd fallen in with, maybe it was just his own insecurity trying to find a target. One Saturday in October, I stopped by his apartment to drop off a misdelivered package. He wasn't home, but he'd told me to just leave it inside. He'd given me a spare key when he first moved in, back when we still had easy trust between us. I set the box on the kitchen counter and was about to leave when I noticed an envelope on the dining table. It was thick, the kind of heavy paper you only see from banks or universities. The seal was already broken. Curiosity got the better of me. I glanced around. Still no sound from the hallway, then slid the letter out just far enough to see the header. It was from the admissions office of a university in London. The date was 2 years old, and the first line under Dear Mr. Lawson was, "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into—" I froze. Michael had told the family that he'd applied on a whim and been rejected. I remembered the shrug, the casual "it's no big deal" he'd given when we asked about it. Now here was proof he'd been accepted, and apparently decided not to go. I didn't take the letter. I didn't even read the rest. I slid it back into the envelope exactly as I'd found it. But as I locked his door behind me, I felt something shift in me. This wasn't just about not going to school. This was about hiding a choice that didn't match the version of himself he wanted the world to see. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more. The way he dodged questions about his career. The way his stories didn't line up when told to different people. The way his fiancée's expression tightened whenever someone mentioned travel or opportunities abroad. By December, I had a pretty clear picture. Michael hadn't stayed because of some noble reason. He'd stayed because going scared him. Scared him enough to build a wall of half-truths to keep it hidden. And every little jab he threw at me was, in its own way, an attempt to distract from the fact that he'd run from his own chance. I hadn't planned to confront him. Honestly, I didn't want to humiliate him. But knowing what I knew made his digs sting less. They were coming from a man trying to bury his own fear. Still, I kept the truth in my pocket. Just in case. And by the time Christmas rolled around, I didn't realize just how ready I was to use it. The letter from that university didn't just sit in my mind. It nested there. For days, I replayed the moment I saw it. How my fingers brushed that heavy paper. How my stomach tightened reading the word accepted. It wasn't just the fact that Michael had lied. People lie all the time, especially to save face. No, what got me was the kind of lie it was. He hadn't failed to get in. He'd been given a door and simply refused to walk through it. And instead of admitting that choice, he'd built a different story, one that kept him comfortable. The more I thought about it, the more I saw the ripple effects. I remembered the year he was applying. He'd been talking about London for months, sending me links to the campus, the programs, the neighborhood where he wanted to live. His eyes lit up every time he described the classes he'd take. I told him it would be hard, that moving across the ocean would demand more from him than anything else in his life. He'd smiled and said, "I know." Then suddenly all that talk had stopped. He told us the school had turned him down. He said it with a shrug, like it barely mattered, and quickly changed the subject. At the time, I'd taken him at his word. Why wouldn't I? Finding that letter cracked open the truth. He'd been scared. Scared of leaving his circle, his comforts, his safety net. Scared of the idea that he might not succeed once he got there. It wasn't just fear of failure, it was fear of even trying. I didn't judge him for feeling that way. I've seen strong men crumble when faced with the unknown. But what I couldn't reconcile was the years that followed. Instead of owning the choice, he'd hidden it behind sarcasm and mockery. Mockery aimed at me, as though deflecting attention from himself. In the weeks after I found the letter, I started watching him more closely. At a family barbecue, someone mentioned their niece had just been accepted into a graduate program overseas. I caught Michael's jaw tighten for half a second before he forced a grin. Later, at his fiancée's birthday, a friend teased him about almost being a London boy, and Michael laughed too quickly, too loudly, before steering the conversation toward my rust bucket truck. That's when it clicked. Every jab at me wasn't random. It was calculated, even if he didn't realize it himself. He needed someone else to look small so he could feel bigger. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not my sister, not his mother, not even Harris, an old friend I usually shared everything with. This wasn't about gossip. This was about understanding my son in a way I hadn't before, and realizing that the image he projected to everyone else was more fragile than I'd imagined. I kept that letter in my mind like a chess player keeps a move in reserve. I didn't know if I'd ever use it, but the thought stayed with me. If Michael ever pushed far enough, if he ever decided to really try and cut me down in front of others, I wouldn't have to yell. I wouldn't have to curse. I'd just have to hold up a mirror. By mid-December, I'd let it go in my day-to-day thoughts. I focused on getting through the holiday preparations, buying gifts, hanging lights, agreeing to host Christmas dinner at my place for the first time in years. But in the back of my mind, I knew the letter was still there. And some part of me, if I'm honest, was waiting to see if he'd give me a reason to pull it out into the light. I've thought a lot about the reasons people lie. Most lies are for gain, money, status, an easier path. Others are to protect someone else. But then there's the third kind, the one that rots a person from the inside. The lie to protect yourself from your own reflection. That's the one Michael had chosen. I could see it clearly once the letter was burned into my memory. He didn't throw away London because of bad timing, or family obligations, or some noble cause. He walked away because he was afraid of measuring himself against people he thought might be better, smarter, faster. Afraid of finding out that his dream, once tested, might crumble. And fear like that doesn't just sit quietly in the corner. It turns into something else: resentment, defensiveness, the need to point out other people's shortcomings before anyone notices your own. That was Michael now. When he was younger, he was the kid who jumped into the deep end before he knew how to swim. The teenager who signed up for school plays even though he couldn't remember lines to save his life. But somewhere along the way, maybe in his early 20s, maybe the first time life told him no, he learned to play it safe. And the thing about playing it safe is you can hide in it forever, if you distract everyone well enough. I didn't plan to use what I knew as a weapon. At first, it was just context, something that explained the growing edge in his voice when he talked to me. But as fall turned into winter, I noticed how much bolder he got in his comments. He'd toss them out in front of people, testing to see how far he could go without me pushing back. I think he believed my silence meant I was weak. That's the trap people like him fall into. They confuse restraint for inability. 2 weeks before Christmas, we met for coffee. He showed up late, shrugged off my questions about work, and then made a joke about how, at least he didn't spend his life in one place like some people. It was just the two of us. But the look in his eyes told me he wished we had an audience. That was when I decided I wouldn't just sit there forever. If the moment came where he crossed the line in front of others, I wouldn't be quiet. Not to embarrass him for sport, but to cut through the performance he'd built for himself. In a way, it wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. Every person at that table knew a version of Michael that wasn't quite real. He'd worked hard to keep them from seeing the cracks. But a man can't fix what he won't face. And sometimes the only way to make him face it is to hold the mirror steady. Christmas was supposed to be about peace, about letting things go. But as the day got closer, I caught myself wondering, if he tried to humiliate me in front of everyone, would I really let it slide? The truth was, I already knew the answer. Christmas night arrived with the kind of stillness you only get after fresh snow. The streets outside were quiet, muffled, the air sharp enough to make your breath visible. Inside, my house was warm, the kind of warmth that clings to you like a blanket. The dining table stretched nearly the length of the room, dressed in a red and gold cloth, candles flickering in the center. The turkey rested on the sideboard, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling every corner. Family filled the seats one by one. My sister and her husband, cousins I hadn't seen since last year. Michael arrived late, as usual, his fiancée on his arm. She smiled when she hugged me, her eyes kind in that careful way people's eyes are when they don't quite know where the tension lies. Michael's smile was wide, his voice loud enough to carry. The first hour was harmless. Stories of childhood Christmases, light teasing about who'd burned the stuffing the year Uncle Dave tried to cook, arguments over which carol was the best. Michael joined in, but I could feel it. Those little glances my way when he spoke, as if checking to see if I was paying attention. It's a skill you learn over time, reading the shifts in a room. People think conversations are just about words, but it's the pauses, the looks, the way someone leans in or sits back that tells you what's really going on. And I could see it in him. He was gearing up. At one point, his fiancée mentioned she'd always wanted to spend Christmas abroad someday. Michael laughed and said, "Not everyone's cut out for big adventures." His gaze sliding to me for just a second too long. I didn't bite, just kept carving the turkey, letting the comment hang in the air until it disappeared under the chatter. Wine flowed, plates emptied and refilled. The room's energy rose, as it always does after a few hours of food and drink. That's when people get comfortable, when they let down the last of their guard. It's also when they're most likely to say what they've really been thinking. I watched him, patient. I wasn't here to provoke him. I didn't need to. People like Michael have a rhythm. They circle closer and closer to the line until they can't resist stepping over it. And when they do, they expect you to stumble, to get flustered, to retreat. By the time the candles had burned halfway down, I could see it in his posture. The lean back in his chair. The way he swirled the wine in his glass like he was about to make a toast. My hand rested lightly against my own glass, not in anticipation of a drink, but in preparation for the shift I knew was coming. This wasn't my first Christmas with him like this, but it would be the first where I didn't walk away from the table carrying the weight alone. It happened just as the main course plates were being cleared. Michael tapped his fork against his glass, the sound bright and sharp over the fading chatter. Heads turned. He smiled, that easy, practiced smile of his, the one that looks warm if you don't know what sits underneath it. I just want to say, he began, how grateful I am to be here tonight, surrounded by family, good food, good wine, and the reminder that sometimes, the best thing you can do in life is accept your limits. A ripple of polite laughter moved around the table. He waited, letting it die down just enough before continuing. Not everyone's meant to go out into the world and chase big dreams, he said, eyes settling on me. Some people are better off keeping it simple, staying in their lane. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that, at least you don't risk failing spectacularly. This time, the laughter was louder. Even his fiancée chuckled, though her eyes flicked toward me quickly, as if checking whether she'd gone too far by joining in. I didn't look away. My fork lay beside my plate, my hands loose in my lap. Inside, I felt nothing like anger. I'd been bracing for this since he walked in the door. Michael leaned back, sipping his wine, scanning the table like a performer gauging his audience. He thought he'd landed his blow. And maybe, for the others they were smiling, shaking their heads, some pretending not to notice the tension that had slipped into the air. But for me, the moment felt like the final bead of water sliding down a glass before it falls. I'd given him enough space to stop himself, to keep the evening decent. He'd chosen not to. I glanced toward the kitchen, where the dessert trays waited. 10, maybe 15 minutes until they were brought out. Enough time for one more shift in the night. When I turned back, Michael was laughing at something a cousin had said. Head tipped slightly, hand gesturing in a wide, open arc. That was the thing about confidence built on a lie. It glowed bright, but it was thin, almost transparent, if you knew where to look. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to match his theatrics. The truth I was holding was heavier than anything he could throw at me. The room was warm, but the moment was cool, still, and waiting. I let the laughter fade before I moved. Slowly, I set my napkin on the table, folded it once, and rested my hands on either side of my plate. My voice, when it came, was calm enough that people had to lean in to hear. You know, Michael, I said, it's funny you talk about chasing big dreams. The conversation around us dimmed, forks pausing midair. Michael tilted his head, still smiling, though his eyes flickered with something. Wariness, maybe. It reminds me of a story, I continued, about someone who had the chance to study at one of the best universities in the world, got the acceptance letter and everything, but for some reason, decided not to go. The silence thickened. Michael's smile froze. His fiancée turned toward him, eyebrows knitting. You told us you didn't get in, my sister said softly. Michael opened his mouth, but I wasn't finished. That's what's interesting, I said, because the letter said otherwise. I've seen it, and I've wondered ever since. Was it fear? Or just not wanting to risk finding out how far you could go? A cousin set his glass down too hard, the stem clinking against the plate. The air felt different now, heavier, charged. That's not, Michael started, but his voice cracked on the second word. No shame in fear, I said, still calm. What's a shame is pretending you never had the chance. His fiancée's gaze stayed on him, her expression unreadable. Someone cleared their throat, but no one spoke. Even the Christmas lights seemed dimmer, the hum of conversation gone. Michael's jaw worked, but the words didn't come. His hands tightened around his napkin until it twisted. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of wine, letting the truth sit in the space between us. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't insulted him. All I'd done was open a door he'd spent years nailing shut. And now everyone could see inside. Michael tried to laugh, but it came out thin, strained. "That's not exactly how it happened," he said, glancing around the table like someone searching for an ally. "I had reasons, personal ones." "What reasons?" his fiancée asked, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. He shifted in his seat. "It just wasn't the right time. He stopped, the sentence withering under the weight of the silence. "Not the right time for what?" a cousin pressed. "You got in. That's the hard part." His eyes flicked toward me, then away. "It's complicated. But the thing about family dinners is that once the crack appears, everyone wants to peek inside." The questions came faster, overlapping. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Were you afraid to go? Did you even think about what it could have meant?" He tried to answer, but each half-formed excuse fell apart under another question. His fiancée didn't say a word after the first, just stared at him, her fork untouched on the plate. I didn't add anything more. I didn't need to. My part was done. I'd put the truth on the table. It was doing the work all by itself now. At one point, Michael ran a hand over his face, eyes squeezed shut for a moment longer than necessary. When he looked up, the confidence he'd walked in with was gone. In its place was something smaller, more fragile. "I just didn't think I'd make it there," he admitted finally, his voice low. "I didn't want to fail. Not in front of all of you." The words hung in the air, naked and unguarded. No one laughed this time. No one even smiled. The table stayed quiet after that. The only sounds the clink of cutlery and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Michael kept his eyes down, stabbing at what was left of his potatoes without actually eating them. His fiancée sat stiff beside him, her hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. When my sister tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, holiday travel plans, the weather, it didn't catch. The mood had shifted too far. The warmth from earlier had drained out, replaced by something brittle and thin. A few minutes later, Michael pushed back his chair. The legs scraped against the hardwood, a sharp sound that made a few people flinch. "I think I'm gonna step outside for a bit," he muttered, not looking at anyone. He didn't wait for a response before walking down the hall. The front door opened, closed, and the cold air slipped in for a moment before the latch clicked shut. Nobody followed him. I reached for my glass, swirling the last sip of wine before finishing it. Around me, people shifted in their seats, rearranging silverware, pretending to check their phones. Small, busy motions meant to fill the space his absence left. In the kitchen, I could hear my niece and her mother discussing dessert, their voices low but steady. The smell of cinnamon and sugar drifted in, familiar and grounding. The world outside might have been still and frozen, but in here, time was moving again. I didn't feel triumphant. That was never the point. But I did feel a certain stillness settle in my chest, the kind that comes from finally putting something in its proper place. By the time the first pie was sliced and plates began to pass around, Michael still hadn't come back inside. And I knew, whether he returned in 10 minutes or stayed out there the rest of the night, that this Christmas would be etched into him just as deeply as it was into me. The pie was warm when it reached me, steam curling from the apple filling, the crust dusted lightly with sugar. Around the table, voices had begun to rise again. Not in laughter, but in that gentle, measured tone people use when they're trying to stitch something back together. I took my time with the first bite. The cinnamon hit first, then the tang of apple, the buttery crumble of the crust. It was good, simple, honest. Everything the last 20 minutes hadn't been. Michael didn't come back before dessert ended. His chair stayed empty, a silent reminder between the turkey platter and the wine glasses. His fiancée slipped away quietly to check on him. I didn't watch them leave. Instead, I poured myself another cup of coffee and listened to the low murmur of conversation. The hard part was over. There'd be questions later, maybe some awkward phone calls in the days ahead. That was fine. I could live with that. What I couldn't live with was letting him keep building his version of the truth unchecked. He'd chosen to mock me in front of everyone. All I'd done was hand him his own reflection. Some lessons are best learned in private. Others, they need an audience. By the time the dishes were cleared and coats gathered from the hall, the snow outside had thickened into a slow, steady fall. I stood at the doorway, saying goodnight to each guest, the cold nipping at my cheeks. When the last of them had gone, I closed the door, turned off the dining room lights, and let the quiet fill the house. In the kitchen, a single slice of pie waited on a plate. I ate it standing at the counter, the sweetness settling on my tongue. Some endings don't need words. This one didn't.